So in 2 weeks, delegates from member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association will gather for our annual General Assembly. And one of the issues before the Assembly will be the adoption of proposed bylaw changes that put forth a set of values that we hold in common at this time in our history. And one of those values is equity, the value that we've been exploring last month and again this month. And the proposed language says this: we declare that every person has the right to flourish with inherent dignity and worthiness. We covenant to use our time, wisdom, attention, and money to build and sustain fully accessible and inclusive communities. So as Unitarian Universalists, when we talk about equity, that's what we're talking about. So today, I invite us to consider how the intersection of equity and class informs our practice of Unitarian Universalism in our congregation and in our lives. Sociologists define social class as a grouping based on similar social factors like wealth, income, education, and occupation. These factors affect how much power and prestige a person has. Social stratification reflects an unequal distribution of resources. So the question for us today, then, is about how matters of class play out in Unitarian Universalism today. I'm still recovering from shoulder surgery. I can't write very well or use a computer, so I have cue cards to help me through this sermon. So thank you for your patience and forbearance. So a prominent theologian of the 20th century was James Luther Adams, and he was fond of saying, "By your roots you shall know them." It's kind of a play on the same wording from the Gospels in the Bible that say, "By your fruits you shall know them." But James Luther Adams said that it was really by our roots. So we're going to take a little bit of a look back at our Unitarian Universalist history with a lens looking at class to help us understand a little bit better how we've become the congregations and the people that we are today. So two people that are often considered to be fathers of our faith, William Ellery Channing on the Unitarian side and Hosea Ballou on the Universalist side, weren't actually the first on American soil, but both of them did scholarly work that set out the tenets of their respective faiths. And within those scholarly works, for William Ellery Channing, he delivered a sermon that kind of set Unitarianism into motion and established it as a denomination on its own. And he wrote the tenets in that sermon titled Unitarian Christianity. And what I wanted to do was compare his take within that Unitarian Christianity sermon on salvation to Hosea Ballou's treatise on atonement, which essentially was about salvation. So when we talk about salvation today, we're not necessarily talking about it in the same way that Ballou and Channing did. They were very much concerned at that time with salvation that would come in an afterlife, that would be after we died. Today we think more in terms of salvation as liberation and freedom and creating that, what we can call the beloved community, the kingdom of God here on earth. But when Ballou and Channing talk about salvation, they're talking about that otherworldly salvation. And Channing held that we achieve salvation through character. In other words, he was holding out that the idea that possibly not everybody was going to make it into heaven, that we made it into heaven by developing a virtuous character and having qualities like compassion and courage and wisdom. Ballou, on the other hand, believed that everybody would go to heaven. The foundational belief of that was that God was too good to damn anybody to eternity in hell, so that eventually everybody would be taken up to heaven. And as we apply those two different ideas about salvation today, I think it says a little bit about who we consider to be in and who we consider to be out. You know, how broad is our inclusiveness? So interesting that Channing was born in a wealthy seaport town, the wealthy seaport town of Newport, Rhode Island. And Ballou was born in a rural farm community of Richmond, New Hampshire. And Ballou, not only was he born in that poor rural farm town, his mother died when he was very young, and he was the youngest of 8 siblings. So those different class backgrounds of these two founders kind of set this idea, this kind of a stereotype. And you know, stereotypes become stereotypes because they're grounded in some truth, but they're also not the real truth or the whole truth. So the stereotype over the years was that the Unitarians came from urban, educated, upper class, and elite backgrounds. Most Unitarians early on were centered in Boston, and so they come by that elite kind of stereotype because most were educated at Harvard. It was kind of expected that that young people would go on to a higher education, and mostly at Harvard. So that became like the stereotype of Unitarians. The stereotype for Universalists, on the other hand, was that they were rural, often lower class, and were farmers and factory workers. And there was also a distinction that was, you could expect to find the Unitarian churches in cities and urban areas, and more likely to find the Universalist churches in rural areas. But even that wasn't entirely true, because there were rural Unitarian churches and there were urban Universalist churches. And part of what made it difficult for both the Unitarians and the Universalists in those rural areas was not so much about income and class, but numbers of people that could fill any congregation and keep it viable for the long term. And what's an interesting fact is that Ballou and Channing both served churches in Boston at the same time, and it is said that they never met each other. But Channing wrote pamphlets, because back in those days what people would do is to put forth their idea or critique somebody else's is write a pamphlet, and those got handed out. So Channing actually wrote a pamphlet critiquing universalism. So back to that idea of these stereotypes of Unitarians and Universalists, it was Thomas Starr King, who was a minister in the 19th century. He held ordination both as a Unitarian and a Universalist, and is credited with saving California for the Union. So he was also a statesperson. But what he would say is that the Universalists believed that God was too good to damn them, while the Unitarians believed that they were too good to be damned. So over the next 100 years, there was, even though there were theological differences, there was a lot of agreement on social issues between the Unitarians and the Universalists. And so they would often collaborate on social movements like working for abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and they were both on the forefront of religious tolerance. And over the years, they really started to grow closer theologically, that the Unitarians started to kind of soften that stance on salvation by character and started to move more towards a universal salvation. And the Universalists started to adopt more of a Unitarian view on Jesus, which was, we see Jesus, or the Unitarians saw Jesus primarily as human with a spark of the divine within, where the Universalists early on believed fully in the Trinity. But over time, they became closer. And it would be the mid-20th century when serious conversations began to be had about joining the two denominations together. And this was a time when both of them were in some pretty serious decline in numbers. And that was true in large part about many denominations across the country at the time. We saw a lot of mergers and joining together of different denominations. So as those talks of consolidating the Unitarians and the Universalists together were happening, there were some fears that were expressed, as you might imagine. And the fear that was most often expressed on the Unitarian side was that they would become subsumed by a Universalist kind of heartfelt religiosity, kind of a head versus heart conversation. They were afraid that their scholarly intellectualism would be subsumed by something different. The Universalists, on the other hand, their fear was that the Unitarians would spend all of their money. Because at the time of consolidation, the Universalists actually did have more money than the Unitarians. And that fear actually came to fruition, but I'm going to hold that for a minute. So at that same time, again, we're talking about like the mid-20th century. I know some of us were alive back then, right? Some of us weren't. But the American Unitarian Association, kind of looking out at the landscape and wanting to revive and expand Unitarianism in the United States, set out to create what is called the fellowship movement. is they sent a couple of ministers around the country to both kind of scout out places where they thought that Unitarianism would get a foothold. And then to go to those places, put ads in the newspaper, and gather people of like mind and establish fellowships. Interesting that the criteria for where they would go for planting these fellowships had to do with who's going to really be drawn to Unitarianism. So largely it was university towns. So that includes First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. So the two denominations did merge, or more appropriately, the language is consolidated in 1961. And what some of the historians say about that time is that the Universalists felt a little bit looked down on in congregations that had merged the two together. And their fear about their money being spent was lived out. The first president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Dana Greeley, had a grand and big vision for what this consolidated movement could be. And it was the Reverend Daniel Harrington who preached the consolidation sermon in celebration that it had happened. He was so bold as to say that Unitarian Universalism would take its place among the great three religions of the world. So he put it up there with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, that we were going to be that grand, that big, and that influential. So Dana Greeley spent a lot of money making that happen, so that by the time his successor, Robert West, took over, there was a real tightening of the belt and cutting back on programs. The Universalists, on the other hand, kept some of their money, so they were organized in state conventions, and there are some of those state conventions that still exist today, and they held on to their money, and they actually funded part of my education. I got a St. Lawrence Foundation grant to study Universalism. So if we take that history and kind of fast forward to our congregations today, and it's true of every congregation that I've been a member of as a layperson and every congregation that I've served as a minister, that the makeup of those congregations are mostly or largely populated by doctors, lawyers, scientists, and white-collar professionals. I remember when I joined the Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbine in Littleton, Colorado, I went back to work and told my coworkers that I had met an actual rocket scientist at church. So that, I think you would agree with me, that's still kind of what we look like today. So I think it's safe to say that our congregations don't look like the beloved community that we dream about and try to create. And this isn't entirely our fault, because we know that our American society is class stratified, and our communities where we live, we pretty much live with people of our own class. And it's human nature to kind of gravitate to the people who are most like us. but I think that our Unitarian Universalist faith asks something more of us. So the question is, what are the barriers? The physical, financial, social, and cultural barriers that keep us from being that place of wide welcome to people of all stations of life. And I hold that we only grow by moving out of our comfort zones. And we do this, there's some things that we can do both individually and collectively as we talk about breaking down some of these barriers. So, in talking with visitors and newcomers, there's some questions that we should not lead with, or I'm going to propose that we should not lead with. So, questions like, where do you live or where do you work? Instead, a conversation opener might be, tell me something about yourself. What brings you here today? What can I tell you about Unitarian Universalism and our congregation? And a particular, I'll own it, pet peeve of mine is when our high school seniors are graduating from high school. The first question should not be, where are you going to college? But what comes next for you? And then I have one more that I think collectively that we should do some serious thinking about. People who rely on public transportation literally take their lives in their hands to get here. To walk from the bus stops on Hillsborough along Woodmont to get here is a very dangerous proposition. So one of the things that we can consider doing is putting pressure on our Metro Council to make some changes, to make at least parts of Nashville more walkable and therefore more accessible. Not to mention just more public transportation in general. So today, I think that we really have incorporated both Channing and Ballou in our ideas about salvation, or like I said earlier, we would say today more about freedom and liberation. We say that character does matter. What we say and do and how we are with each other matters, and that none of us are truly free until all of us are free. This is the Unitarian Universalism that I foresee, and I think that it is in our capacity to make it real. So may the equity we seek become real through the ways we live out our faith now and in the future. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.